Why should a biracial person identify as black? It is a question that many ask but few dare to elaborate and answer so as not to offend many blacks who see a biracial person as one of them. Behavior that still persists in the slave mentality in many blacks when they see the blackness in other people through the eyes of white masters. Confused, self-hatred, brainwashed, ignorant, lives in denial, better than me, wants to be white, are some of the expressions used by many blacks as a mechanism of intimidation to keep the biracial or mulatto in their corner. Where did this need of many blacks begin to see the biracial or mulatto as one of them? Racially, the mulatto is different from the blacks if we use logic, but when we talk about race, our emotions are what determine the reality we perceive. A dark-skinned black woman looks at her biracial son or daughter as part of herself emotionally speaking, although something tells her that it is different. Recognizing this racial difference is something that blacks have not historically assumed, unless the masters allow it. 2 centuries after the abolition of slavery, the blacks still do not dare to have an idea of themselves different from what the slavery masters have of the blacks, and of their descendants. Despite all the freedoms that we enjoy at this moment, still the blacks look at themselves through the eyes of their white masters. Reasons why the mothers of the biracial or mulatto children look at them as blacks, because the white people decided so. When speaking of the mulattoes, the blacks are still waiting for the whites to give them permission to see them different from them. In defense of black women, we must understand that the concept of race was never a collective conscience of blacks. Therefore, although the biracial children were different, seeing their daughter as part of it is normal. But do not make a mistake in believing that the masters of the slaves did not understand those racial differences. Reasons why this type of biracial children were considered by the masters as a mulatto slave. For a black mother, the mulatto racial classification of one of her sons or daughters was a denomination that they avoided using because they lost the feeling of their children being part of them. Sense of belonging of a mother to her children, which is important for the general welfare of the child. To understand this feeling of maternal belonging, we must analyze it within a historical context in which everything that was the product of the work of a black slaves belonged to their masters. That also included everything produced by the womb of a black woman in which the children born belonged to her master. A mother suffered for the future of her black children in the hard work in the plantations, but she also understood that a mulatto son or daughter, due to racial differences, acquired greater importance before her masters, which diminished the opportunity for her to raise him as own. Let's not get lost. The mulattoes enjoyed certain racial privileges during the era of slavery, but they were also the most desired in the American slave market, especially the mulatto women. For a black woman, giving birth to a mulatto girl was something she did not want, because of the value that mulatto girl represented for her master at a time when slaves were seen as merchandise. One way to protect mulatto girls at the time of their birth was to see her as a black woman who would work in the field next to her, not as a concubine to her master's friends. Right now, in which we are in a post-slave era, blacks have no excuse to continue seeing the biracial or mulatto as part of this community, because they are not. Whether you want to accept it or not, the biracial is a type of intermediate racial subgroup between the blacks and the white ones that we should celebrate as a unique identity, which is different from the others. Many blacks talk about a racial dialogue between blacks and whites to reduce conflicts, but very few recognize intermediate racial groups such as biracials as an important part of this dialogue. In American society, with the power that whites have always had, one way to handle racial and class problems was to create 2 racial groups in which everyone who had a single drop of black blood was considered black and the rest as white. The whites saw in the mulattoes a danger in the distribution of the racial privileges destined for them, which the mulattoes received in their biracial condition. The whites taught or conditioned the blacks to see and accept the mulattoes as part of their community, even though they all knew the racial differences that existed between the black mother and her biracial or mulatto children. Why right now the mulatto or the biracial is still forced by some blacks to self-identify as black. Starting from my point of view, still the blacks see the mulattoes through the eyes of white slave owners, in which the mulatto was seen as a commodity, not as an individual with the same rights as his master and in many cases his white father. The mulatto was a possession of his white father, but was never accepted as part of the master's family. No matter how much free thinking many blacks say they have, when speaking of the mulattoes, They still follow the slave mentality of white supremacy in their persistence of including the mulattoes or biracials as racially equal to the blacks. As a way to maintain the purity of the white race, the slave owners pushed the mulattoes towards their black family as a way of separating them from their white family. Racially speaking, historically and genetically, we all know that the mulatto is not black, but neither is he white. He is a racially hybrid person. On that side, blacks and white supremacy have the same idea of inclusion by racial association when speaking of mulattoes in relation to blacks, but never in relation to viewing the mulattoes as part of the white community. As blacks, we have simply been complicit with the white masters repeating this lie as a truth which justifies the purity of the white race against the existence of the mulattoes and their racial closeness to the whites. Whites throughout history have taught us to see the mulattoes as part of the black community, denying any idea that the mulatto can be part of the white community as well. A product of racial mixing. See how easy it is to say that the mulatto is black and difficult to accept that the mulatto is white. That is why this social perception of race is when we talk about the mulattoes, because race is for blacks what white people have defined as race. Blacks start from that vision of race promoted by whites in which they only see blackness, not whiteness. 500 years of mental slavery, we still continue repeating as African American community the same lies told by our white race masters. When we talk about the mulattoes or biracial children born to slave black women, who are pregnant by their white masters, accept these biracial children as blacks, never as part of the white racial group. The racial privileges that mulattoes enjoy over blacks in a post-slavery society is a reflection of this historical reality that no Negro can deny at this time. If blacks and mulattoes were racially equal, both groups were obtaining the same racial privileges with the preferential treatment that the mulattoes had in relation to the blacks. That tells you that before the eyes of the white slavers the mulattoes and the blacks were considered racially different. Why do blacks look at the mulatto as equal? To know this difference we must ask the black women and the influence of Jim Crow's lays in the conscience of the American people when we talk about race. White supremacy through mental conditioning has taught blacks to see the Negroid characteristics in the mulattoes or biracial, but never the European characteristics, which makes the mulatto part of that community as well. Up to this moment, we all participate as part of white supremacy, as long as we do not identify the slave mentality that controls our thoughts and attitudes. If you like this topic, please let me know through your comment.